Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, a new initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about unlocking decarbonisation funding and the journey to net zero with some of the construction industry's leading experts who will introduce themselves now.
Hi, Tom. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm Jack Saunders. I'm an Associate Director at Atkins Realis, working in our net zero team, and I focus predominantly on retrofit of the built environment for a low-carbon future.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jose Hernandez. I'm the Head of Sustainability and Energy at Pick Everard, where I'm also a Director. And we cover all the wide range of sectors, public work, sector work, private sector as well. And we are fully multidisciplinary, so fully embedded into the requirements for decarbonisation.
And proving they don't save the best to last. I'm David Kemp, an Associate Director at Turner & Townsend. I work primarily in the housing space. I'm currently the Programme Director for some very large government programmes that are designed to support the social housing sector, and local authorities apply for and deliver domestic retrofit.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, all. Now, if you've tuned into our previous Pagabo Live session, today's is a little bit different to the previous two. So here's what we've got coming up. Rather than our regular presentations, today's event's more of a Q&A session, a chat show, if you will. Thank you very much to our community members for their questions they've submitted ahead of the session. So they're what we're going to start the Q&A off with, and we're putting those around sort of 10, 12 of those to our panel first. But we'd also love it if you, as watchers now, can get involved. So please feel free to send as many questions as you'd like, ideally with your names on, but you can keep them anonymous if you'd like. You can send those in using the Q&A function on Zoom. It should be at the bottom of your screen currently. We'll also be running polls as usual throughout the session, so make sure you're responding to those, and that will help sort of guide the conversations that we're having. And right on cue, here is that first poll. So if we could fire that poll up, please. It's about how knowledgeable you are on accessing decarbonisation funding on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being not very aware, 4 being very aware. Has that poll started yet, guys? Thank you. I'll give you around 30 seconds to answer those. And what we'll do is we'll also then refer back to the responses that we get on this at the end, and you'll be able to reply again. You'll be able to be asked the same question again. So hopefully we'll see that you have sort of grown that knowledge. So if you close that poll now, please. So I would say the good news for this session is that we've got a large percentage of people in the lower end of that scale in terms of knowing about accessing decarbonisation funding. Doing my quick maths, I'm a words guy, not a numbers guy, so apologies if I get this wrong, but looking at that, 78% of people are sort of less than moderately knowledgeable about decarbonisation funding. So no pressure, guys, but all on you today to make sure that's better. And actually, with that, we'll get into the first question, and we'll put this one to you, David. So are the dates put in place for the net zero journey achievable?
The dates, well, anything's inherently achievable as long as there's sufficient will and sufficient finance, whether that's government funding or private finance, to actually get there. You know, the usual analogy, you can have something quick or cheap or high quality. You know, you can't get all three things necessarily at once. I think there is certainly an appropriate level of ambition from public and private sector organisations around their transitions to net zero, and, you know, targets are flashing up left, right and centre. Whether or not those targets are being set in a considered fashion, I think it is debatable. So at Turner & Townsend, we don't just do housing stuff, obviously. Some of our clients that we have worked with in a corporate space, one of the first jobs that we've had to do with them is actually highlight to them that the targets that they themselves have set aren't deliverable based on the wider programs that they've got in terms of, you know, the activities that they've got planned and the cash available to them to do so. So the simple and the relatively easy get out clause is, yeah, anything's achievable as long as, yeah, you've got the will and you've got the finance to do so. And, you know, does Jose or Jack have anything to come back in on that point?
I think that an important aspect to highlight is that, you know, when we are talking about, for example, 2050, as the target for the UK to achieve net zero carbon. The date is important, but more important than that is the journey, is the transition, is how quickly we are spending the carbon budget that we have available till things continue to get worse and worse. So speed of decarbonization is of incredible importance. It's not just the end point; it's the whole journey that we have to go through over the next few years.
It's the area underneath the graph, as it were, that's important. And this is an analogy that I've used elsewhere. If we do nothing and we continue to produce emissions to the extent that we are doing, and suddenly overnight in 2049 everything suddenly becomes net zero, we're still going to fry, because there's too much carbon already in the atmosphere, and yeah, we're going to be a little bit knackered on that front. So yeah, you're quite right, Jose. Timing and action is as important as the date.
Brilliant, great stuff there, guys. We'll pass this one. Actually, we'll push one to you as well, David, just to keep you on the hot seat. So what are the challenges that you see in reaching that decarbonised economy we've been talking about?
Well, I've mentioned will and I've mentioned finance, and they are two of the very significant challenges that we need to overcome. I think there is, despite best efforts of the likes of UK Green Building Council and others, there's still a lack of understanding around what net zero actually is. So one of the first things we might be, and I'm sure it's the same for Jose and Jack, one of the first things we're asked when we're engaging with a contractor or a client about a building project is, how do I get this building to net zero? What do I have to do to be net zero? It's like, well, what does it actually mean to you as an organization? Are we considering whole life carbon? So, cradle to cradle, in effect, whole life carbon costing and such? Are we looking at operational energies? That's what's important to you. So defining what the client actually means and wants to achieve it is possibly one of the first and most important hurdles to get over. This obviously webinar is more focused, I think, on the finance side of things, and I do want to draw an issue or a particular challenge associated with that. Yes, we've got cash, and in the housing space, government's announced something like 1.75 billion over the next 3 years, 25 to 28, for domestic decarbonisation, both social housing and owner-occupied spaces. But if we've got the money, but we haven't necessarily got the supply chain in place to be able to deliver that, I've got 50 quid to spend. Who can I spend it with? Well, nobody, because we're already busy doing other things. So there is an issue around supply chain capacity. When you speak to the main contractors and other installers of energy efficiency technologies, they challenge that slightly, and to an extent I see their point. Yes, you can, there are sufficient bodies to deliver this activity. It's how we're delivering it. So taking the point around we've got to go far, we've got to go fast. If we all go to market for the same stuff at the same time, there aren't enough contractors that are able to deliver the needs of the sector, regardless of how much cash you've got. If we're able to deliver our decarbonisation programs in a slightly more considered and organic fashion, supply chain can grow in line with the deployment of finance into the marketplace, so that there aren't those pinch points when it comes to actually going to market for contractors to do stuff. So I ain't touched on the will, but I'll let others come in if they got views on some of those challenges.
I completely agree with what you're saying, David. I think the skills gap is a significant challenge that we're facing. Finding enough people to be able to deliver this at scale and quickly, and I think that there's a lot to be done in that space. Between kind of public and private sector, really.
That very nicely feeds onto. Welcome back, Jack. By the way, we can hear you fantastically. You don't sound like you're a robot at the bottom of a well, so that's a good start.
Excellent, always good.
The response there actually feeds really nicely. We'll stay with you on this one, Jack. Actually, into the role the private sector has to play in supporting that net zero journey. I think you touched on it there in terms of skills and obviously expansion of the supply chain in particular.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think with a challenge of this scale and complexity, it really does require that kind of complete cross-sector, multi-sector collaboration. I think
everybody's got a role to play in here. I think, again, touching on the theme of the webinar, I think the private sector's got a key role to play in the financing space. So looking at blended financing options, as I said earlier, particularly from institutional investors, looking at where we can kind of bring the scale of capital that's required to deliver net zero into the planning. I think driving the expansion of the supply chain, again, it's a kind of key private sector activity. The demand is there and is growing. So making sure that they're kind of mobilizing and expanding to reach that. I also think sort of looking in that innovation space. So thinking about, the creation of new technologies or improving those technologies. I mean, I think we've already seen, for example, quite a lot of movement in the last few years around high temperature heat pumps and what that might mean in terms of the decarbonisation of heating. So really kind of, creating that innovation within the supply chain and sort of filling that market demand. I think, touching on the skills gap as well. I think, the private sector's got a key role to play in addressing that skills gap. Making sure that the transition to a low carbon economy is sustainable as well. There's no benefit in moving across to net zero if hundreds of engineers are out of roles and things like that. We need to make sure that there's a really kind of transition plan, and the private sector's got a key role to play in that.
Excellent. Well, good stuff in that first section, guys. And we are bang on time, so well done to you all for keeping to schedule so far. We're going to now move on to our second poll question. So if you could fire that up now, please. Do you think the government is doing enough to deliver on net zero targets? Now we've got a yes and no there, and we've also got a real cop-out somewhat answer. So it'll be interesting to see how many people go for the somewhat. People are willing to nail their colours to the mast on whether they think that the government is delivering on net zero targets or doing enough to help deliver on net zero targets. To give you another 10 seconds or so to answer that, and then we'll get the poll responses up. And if we could close that now, please. I think that's a very clear no. Well, well done to the 3% of you that said yes, your jobs in government are safe. Don't worry. But a very large percentage of people there, 73% of people saying no, they don't believe the government is doing enough to help deliver on net zero targets. It'd be very interesting, actually. Put it in the Q&A if you are one of the people that did say that you think the government is doing enough to deliver on the net zero targets. It'd be interesting to hear an alternative point of view on that. What we'll do is we'll move on to our next question now. We'll keep this one with you, actually, Jack. So what are the typical types of decarbonisation work we're carrying out?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I think it's probably worth bringing this back to the greenhouse gas protocol and looking at your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I would say the majority of decarbonisation work that we see at the moment tends to focus on scope 1 and 2, reducing particularly operational carbon from the built environment. So I think that's sort of areas where people perhaps are a bit more comfortable. So looking at retrofit, looking at decarbonisation of heating sources. So typically swapping out fossil fuel boilers for some form of heat pump, usually an air source, but possibly not, or kind of connection into sort of district heating schemes and those types of things. We also see a lot in that space around and are starting to see a little bit around offsetting as well. I think as we sort of then start to look at scope 3, this is very much a kind of growing area. I think focus is being drawn onto this a little bit more, and it's great to see organisations starting to work really collaboratively with their supply chains to understand how they can start to decarbonise their scope 3 emissions, but both upstream and downstream, which is really good to see. I think there's kind of quite a long way to go there, but there's some really positive collaboration happening with organisations in that space. I think the other things that we see quite typically are I suppose, on a sort of more national and larger scale. These projects around large-scale renewable generation. There's obviously the nuclear program as well, and then some of the kind of grid balancing type activities that we have as well. So starting to look at sort of energy storage look like. So I think those are probably some of the typical decarbonisation works that we're seeing in the UK at the moment.
If I'm all right jumping in just for a second on that one, Tom, as well. Obviously, from a technical perspective, don't disagree with any of that, and I'm sure it's the same for Jose as well. Those are the kinds of physical works and projects that we're seeing in our day-to-day work and all. But through one of the groups that I sit on with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and other kind of like strategic authorities like that, there's an increasing recognition on the role of the individual. So even in decarbonisation at scale, so even where we're doing a corporate decarbonisation plan, and most of it is lighting and BMS and heating systems and so on and so forth, one of the things that we're promoting quite heavily now is this concept of carbon literacy. So being able to communicate and explain in, I don't like the phrase plain English, but I can't remember what it's been replaced with. But, simple terms in a language that resonates with the audience that you're dealing with, why this is important to them as individuals, but equally why it's important to them as a business, and so on and so forth. And a lot of the activity on this front can deliver meaningful carbon savings as well. The Carbon Literacy Trust, for example, they've, I think, modelled savings of between 10 and 15% of a corporate's carbon footprint saved just by engaging with the staff. So before you start looking at the whiz bang bits and bobs, things that you can bolt onto your building or slap on it, actually engaging with the staff can deliver real meaningful carbon reduction without significant capital outlay. So we're factoring that in more and more now into the projects that we're delivering.
So it's a bit like making decarbonisation more mainstream, I guess, is probably the best way of describing it.
Well, yeah, whether or not you like air source heat pumps or you understand what external wall insulation is and how it operates, the fact that I know now why it's important to switch the light off when I leave the room, that makes sense to me. I get it now, too. And it's little nudge behaviours like that which complement massively the more capital intensive works. If we just look at it as a technological problem or technological solutions, we're still going to miss things because we know you can have a super efficient building, leave the windows open and the heating on.
Yeah, you're completely right, David. We need to redefine what is the business as usual scenario and make decarbonisation the way we do things.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's becoming, on that theme of becoming mainstream, it actually feeds into the next question of what as well regarding refurb versus new build and the pros and cons there. Obviously, there's been a lot in the news recently about Oxford Street and the M&S store there, and the appeal that's gone on regarding whether that building is going to be knocked down and rebuilt, whether the embodied carbon already in there is already too much. So, I'd be interested to get some views from yourself first, Jose, and then David afterwards. The pros and cons around refurb and new build in terms of decarbonisation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like everything, there isn't always a single or predefined solution. There are pros and cons to both options. It very much depends also on what aspect we are looking at. What are we trying to improve or to optimize? If we're looking at carbon emissions, first we should be looking at whole life carbon emissions. That's been brought earlier on. And we need to also understand what's the balance between the operational carbon emissions, the carbon emissions emitted during the life, the operation of that building, but also the embodied carbon that we are spending right on construction and then during other improvements during the lifetime of the building, and the factors that are affecting that. A clear example is the decarbonisation of the electricity grid that is continuously happened. That's happened very significantly over the last years. We have the projections of the reduction for the electricity grid in the coming years, forecast for the next 40 years and so on. So when we are making those changes, it's very critical in the decarbonisation process. To me, it's clear that there needs to be a significant increase and greater focus on refurbishments. We all know that the majority of the buildings that we will have in 2050 are already here, and they are challenging. Refurbishment can be challenging processes. You have to get the balance of how much you can improve and reduce the operational carbon versus how much you are increasing the embodied carbon by doing so. Beforehand, you would have argued that it's easier to refurbish a building in one go. However, sometimes what happens is that there may be some parts of improving a building that are easier or faster to implement, and others maybe they are more disruptive to the operation of the building. There is an argument to create and consider hybrid temporary solutions that allow certain improvements to be done in the first place, and then complete the improvement of the, say, for example, the building fabric works later on. Then we have the whole aspect of cost, and cost again is not capital cost; it's whole life. It's whole life cost. Obviously, there is a difference in capital cost between a new build and a refurbishment. You need to include the maintenance. You need to include the need for building improvements, and also the materials that we use in construction should also be decarbonizing as we move along. So we need to make sure that we are calculating the embodied carbon, we are calculating the operational carbon. We take a whole life approach to all these aspects, and then we are in a position to make informed decisions, proposals to our clients.
David, anything to add on that?
It's nice to see that everyone on the panel. Well, yeah, we're all aligned, which is nice to see. And equally, we've all used, I think, the consultancy's best friend, which is there's no right or wrong answers, or it depends before we start our answer. And I'll pick up on that point. Yes, from a decarbonisation perspective, with increased grid decarbonisation, the operational energy reduces even further because of embedded generation and all that kind of stuff. The argument for new build as a means to save carbon reduces even further. It becomes less of an issue. Embodied carbon becomes the main component or source of carbon in that particular building. But that said, we need to be mindful of what are the drivers for the desire to demolish a building anyway. If it is purely to reduce operational carbon, and there's shed loads of studies that demonstrate, certainly at a domestic perspective, a net zero carbon in operation building needs to be standing and operating truly in a net zero carbon fashion for something like 60 to 80 years before it's repaid the embodied carbon within its construction. Is it going to last that long? Well, who knows? So we know that operationally it doesn't necessarily stack up versus the embodied energy contained within the existing building. However, if that building was an eyesore, if it was a source of contempt in a local community, engendered antisocial behaviour, there are myriad other reasons and legitimate sustainability considerations that sit behind. Actually, it's better to get rid of that and build something new. So pros and cons from a carbon perspective, from an operational carbon perspective, I don't see it making much sense. But when you take into account wider issues, there may well be significant justification for dropping a building and building something new. So case by case, no right or wrong answers.
I think the other thing to add to that as well is I completely agree with everything that's been said, but I think it's also worth thinking about whether the building is fit for purpose, and just because it's not fit for the purpose of the current occupier doesn't mean that it wouldn't work for somebody else. So I think it's worth thinking about, well, is the option demolish or refurb, or is the option maybe add in the third option of actually move to another building that might be more suitable, but somebody could then come in behind you in your current building and sort of pick it up from there.
Imagine a hermit crab if it left its shell and it knackered it, and somebody else can fit just right in behind it.
We need to consider the risk of stranded assets. As you all say, is that building going to function in the next few years? And sometimes we may need to be brave and ask the client, Mr. Client, do you really need a new build?
That's it. Well, the bravery in there is we'll see how that goes down with clients. Let's move on to the next question. We'll keep with sort of Jose and David on this, but feel free to chip in as well, Jack, if it works for you. We'll go to you first on this one, Jose. Does accounting for net zero then cost more overall?
I think that following up on some aspects that we have mentioned before. First, cost. What cost are we talking about? We need to be looking at whole life cost. Capital operational is a whole life cost, and also include as a factor there what's the cost of carbon. Should there be a price to carbon? What is the cost of doing or not doing anything, or not doing enough down the line? I just make reference before to stranded assets. What's the cost of not doing anything and then ended up with a building that is not functioning? It doesn't serve its purpose. So it's a whole balance between how much capital cost we can afford, but is that leading us to the right solution or to the best solution, not only from an economic perspective, but from an environmental perspective. And it's interesting to see that, sectors that are very linked to accounting, real estate and banks and pension funds and all that are quite aware of the cost of stranded assets, of the cost of not doing anything, of the whole impact that further down the line there is also on health and well-being. So overall, net zero carbon will not cost more once we redefine and understand the cost of not doing anything or not doing enough.
And I suppose adding to that equally is the costs of finance itself. So yeah, stranded assets and all that kind of stuff, and everything that Jose's mentioned, bang on. If you need to borrow money to build something, we are seeing financial institutions offering significantly more competitive rates of finance to those organisations that have got a compelling and auditable and clear path and pathway and transition towards net zero. I can give you 50 quid at 5% for your horrible building, or I can give you 50 quid at 0.5% because you're going to go for a zero carbon one. And taking into account the duration of some of the finance packages out there, a small difference in the cost of finance can make a significant difference on the overall business case for said building. So yeah, all of that other stuff, and equally financial institutions themselves are mindful and want to encourage this sort of stuff because they are reporting on it themselves. Their finance into the sector, it is and should be accounted within their scope 3. So the emissions from the building that they're funding you to build are on the carbon balance sheet, for want of a better phrase.
That feeds really nicely into the next section that we're moving on to, which is specifically around the funding and some of the options that there are available and some of the business cases that are required for those. But before we get onto that, we'll actually like to move on to another audience poll. So if you could fire that one up now, please. And the question is, are you looking for decarbonisation funding for any of your upcoming projects? So there is a yes, there is a no, and there is the middle ground answer of not just yet, maybe in the future. So it'd be interesting to see what we get there. But looking at the conversation we've had so far, I feel like the funding question is one that's really, really pertinent at the moment. So we'll just have another 10 seconds on those before we go into our next and final section of the pre-submitted questions. And if you could also, if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask, we can already see some coming in on the Q&A at the moment. So feel free to add a few more of those as we get towards the open audience Q&A section. So if we could close that poll now, please.
Oh.
So there are quite a lot of people, around 44%, looking to be taking up some decarbonisation funding in the relatively near future. And if you combine that with those that are looking in maybe the slightly more distant future, there's a fairly significant percentage of those tuned into this webinar that are looking at options around funding. So that would be an opportune time to bring in the next question. We'll go to you first on this one, Jack, to talk about some of the Salix funding. So what funding is there available and how can it be bid for?
Yeah, of course. So I think Salix operate a number of different funds. I think within England, the two key schemes that are available at the moment are the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which is due to launch pretty much any time now, with guidance coming out on the Salix website imminently. And then there's also the public sector decarbonisation scheme. So the kind of key difference between those two Salix funds, the former is designed to support people to plan projects. So smaller amounts of grant funding designed to help you to develop a heat decarbonisation plan. So looking at your buildings, how you might take forward different decarbonisation interventions and get you ready to apply for the main scheme. The main scheme being that public sector decarbonisation scheme, which we are expecting to launch sometime towards the end of the year, autumn sort of time, and that's the kind of the main capital funding pot to provide the capex needed to deliver these projects. The scheme is kind of runs in a couple of different ways. I think it actually ties into one of the questions that I think I've seen come through in the Q&A. So some of the funding is available on a one-year basis, which is kind of quite a tight turnaround in terms of the delivery of that project. There is also typically some of the funding that's available for longer term projects as well. So over kind of 2 to 3 years, depending on the criteria for the scheme at the time. So we are still waiting on the latest guidance for those schemes as to exactly how they will be structured. But they are due to be coming out again this year.
Jack, hot off the press on the Low Carbon Skills Fund, the details have been announced this morning. Actually, as you were, it was imminent. It's out there. So yeah, clients can have access to funding to get assistance in developing their heat decarbonization plans.
In addition to those, I suppose the larger Salix finance related ones, there are some smaller funding pots that might be available regionally. So in the northeastern Yorkshire, for example, we're delivering a public estate decarbonisation programme with the Tees Valley Combined Authority, which Yorkshire-based public sector organisations can apply to for heat decarbonisation plans and other bits and bobs of support. There are some other smaller charities like Key Fund Yorkshire, again in Yorkshire and the Northeast, that are providing grants to community organisations. There's the Low Carbon, I think it's the Low Carbon Energy or Community Energy Fund that's knocking around. And again, the Northwest and the Northeastern Yorkshire and other net zero hubs, I believe, are administering that. I would like to make a plug, if that's the right phrase, for the impending Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and the as of yet unnamed Local Authority Retrofit Scheme. I mentioned it earlier, I'm just going to ram it home again. There's 1.75 billion or thereabouts, which is expected to be dropping onto the sector potentially as early as this summer, which obviously social housing providers, they will be required to put in match funding. So if they're setting budgets now, think about a 50% match funding contribution for a retrofit program, work it into your forward plans at this moment in time, whereas the LARS is fully funded. But it's coming, and it's going to be significant. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero has commissioned Turner and Townsend to deliver free support into the sector. It was the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator and Home Upgrade Hub, new name coming. But keep your eyes and ears peeled, because that's a lot of money to do a lot of good stuff.
David, you mentioned the net zero hubs. I think it's important, useful for people to check there, because they can find more information on community energy grants, also green skills training grants. We discussed that before, and understand how it relates to their local action energy plans. And understand what projects there are in their areas and how they may be able to benefit from those ones.
Obviously specific to a particular region or locality, but in some cases, some significant support that's available.
Absolutely, and I think there are funding schemes as well targeting kind of specific technologies as well. So I think things like the Green Heat Network Fund as well. So, if you're looking at those types of projects, there's specific funding for them as well.
So quite a bit, really.
Lots of different options out there.
Yeah.
We'll stick with you on this one, Jack, actually. So obviously when applying for any of these tranches of funding, there needs to be a real strong business case to go along with them. So how do you create that kind of effective business case for net zero?
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of topic in and of itself, really, I think, isn't it? But there's a huge number of ways that you can kind of create really strong business cases, and they're each sort of a bit nuanced and a bit organizational specific. But I think some of the kind of key themes that people should be looking for in business cases is making sure that you're maximizing the benefits. So I think sometimes we can get a bit sort of wrapped up in our own world and forget to think about the wider context that some of these projects sit within. So really looking at how you can sort of work with other departments to maybe maximize co-benefits, looking at what improvements you might be making to the public realm as well as to net zero, what that might do for air quality around schools and things like that. So looking at all of these types of issues that are kind of front and center of everybody's minds at the moment, but trying to do that across as many departments as you can. So so that you can align your business case to as many as your organizational priorities and targets as possible. And I think once you start kind of bringing that collaboration into it and bringing all of these other departments on board, it suddenly becomes a much stronger business case. You have people from different areas, if it's a local authority, different areas of the local authority, all championing the same project because it brings them some benefit as well. So I think it's really important to kind of consider the stakeholders in the round and look at how you can collaborate as much as possible. I think it's also important, to do kind of good housekeeping and good governance around your business case too. So making sure that you're exploring funding options in detail. I think we just talked through a few of them on the previous question. There's a lot of different funding out there. Have you explored which funds might be appropriate, which might be suitable, how you can maybe supplement some of the CapEx that you're asking for with grant funding? What would it mean if you get it versus if you don't get it? How does that affect the business case? I think also, we talk about benefits, and I think sometimes the benefits can be a slightly sort of theoretical and abstract thing, and there's these sort of green book supplementary guidance around how you quantify that from a financial perspective, but actually really understanding what that means for you as an organization, what that means in terms of the benefits that you're going to receive, and how that impacts if you look at sort of different counterfactuals as well. And I think the other important thing with the benefit piece is to make sure that you're looking at your measurement and verification. So actually, what is the plan to make sure that you're seeing the benefits that you're suggesting that you will, and if you're not seeing those benefits, how are you going to rectify that? And as you move through the project, how do you make sure that those benefits don't kind of get value engineered out of the design as well? So I think it's really important to have those kind of strong kind of governance principles flowing through your business case and flowing through the project development as well. David and Jose, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
I would strengthen the reference to the price of carbon evaluation that you can put on there. We've assisted in some outline and full business cases where once you account and you put a price to a ton of CO2, that can be significantly change the decision-making process and the end result that us as designers and clients decide to take.
Yeah, in a similar fashion, that cost of finance and the cost of carbon hand in hand. Equally, if as an organization you have committed to and you are delivering a net zero or a decarbonisation strategy and it requires offsets, what does the impact of going for a non-energy efficiency building or what is that difference? What would that actually equate to in additional offsets that you'd need to buy as an organization? If a full cost of carbon is a step too far, just looking at that kind of metric, if I need to buy another 3/4 of a forest in Zimbabwe or what have you, what does that cost? Whack that into commercial consideration.
David, related to offsets, I think that as you mentioned, is our own organizations, but at the end, our carbon footprint, as important as it is that we become net zero, our greatest impact by far every day, every year is what we are delivering for our clients. That's by no means we're not saying it's not important that ourselves become net zero carbon, but in reality, what we will end up, the legacy we will end up leaving is that one that we give for our clients. Absolutely,
and there's a key risk avoidance piece in all of this as well, isn't there? I think if we look at climate change and climate adaptation and resilience and things like that, there's a big risk avoidance aspect to all of these net zero projects.
It ties back to the old school, I suppose, principles around sustainable procurement. What's the reputational impact from not doing so as well? How does that impact on a business case? The fact that what you've done has exacerbated something else somewhere in the world. Is it appropriate that you are not pursuing a net zero carbon building when your competitors are? Yeah, reputational impact again can be factored into that business case argument.
And that really nicely feeds us on to the next question there, David, regarding accounting for net zero during procurement. How's the best way of doing that?
Well, Jose's already kind of answered that question for me, which is nice. You can look at incorporating within your commercial model or your commercial evaluation that cost of carbon. So when you're providing indicative designs or whatever, you're going to build it. What is the modelled carbon emissions associated with this building from an embodied and operational perspective? you whack in your internal cost of carbon to that, and you can compare submission A against submission B. Theirs is a little bit more expensive on a capital perspective, but my cost of carbon that I'm applying means that actually, overall, it's significantly cheaper. Taking the offset thing as well, we know what's the cost of the offsets I would need to buy to make this a net zero building. Chuck that on. That is one particular way of incorporating net zero considerations into your procurement activity. But most importantly, I think even before we get down that route, it's knowing what we're asking contractors to price. And it goes back to my earlier comment around clients that don't know what net zero means to them. We are working on a live project at the minute and the client wants a net zero building. But what is it? Contractor A might price bells, whistles and the works, embodied carbon, full cradle to cradle, UKGBC framework, zero carbon building. Another one might assume that they're just thinking about, I don't know, the carbon associated with my operatives getting to and from site. So but without a clear definition of what it is you want people to deliver for you, you can't compare apples with apples, and your procurement process will be a little bit skewed. So being clear on what you want, and then if you have already got that cost of carbon, thinking of how you can account in monetary terms carbon into your procurement decisions.
Sorry, Jose.
No, I fully agree in terms of that, and we need to make sure that we are inserting carbon targets that we say, okay, this building, the EUI, the energy use intensity should not exceed these levels. This is the embodied carbon that you need to be delivering, making sure that we are doing making whole life carbon costing mandatory, and NEC now has a clause. I think it's. Remember, I think it's X29 that refers to climate change, to commit to reducing the impact of climate change. Probably it's not much in use yet, and it will bring certain challenges to us, but is for the greater good.
It boils back to that being clear about what you want. If you've got a good design and you're able to specify new values and energy use intensity and this, that, and the other, go to market. If you're more looking for a design-led solution, again, being clear around net zero carbon in operation. This includes, base build as defined by, I don't know, the neighbours scheme. Being clear to the market, what is it they need to account for, and then making sure that whatever's left over, in some way, shape, or form, you're able to attribute a price to it.
Excellent. Well, we're heading into our final question before we go into a sort of hopefully around sort of 8 or 10 minutes of audience Q&A. I think I probably know the answer to this one, but I'll go to you for it, Jose. When should people act on net zero? I imagine the answer is probably yesterday.
Well, I was going to start by saying it's certainly not tomorrow. It's not even today. It was yesterday, and by yesterday we don't mean just yesterday. Frankly, we have been talking about what we need to do in buildings. Obviously, this extends well beyond buildings. It's also about transport. It's about water. It's about electrical infrastructure. It's about systems thinking. Here we are talking about people, and I think that's also a very important consideration. I think that it was mentioned earlier on the importance of individuals, and I think that obviously. During the COVID pandemic and lockdown, we saw a reduction in carbon emissions that has come up. We just need to make sure that some of the tough lessons that we had to learn, we continue to benefit from those. Obviously, there is more hybrid working now. But we just need to make sure that we are thinking about it. It's not just every project; it's every day. And there are some lifestyle choices. There are some options that are there. There's discussions about what are the 15-minute neighborhoods as an example. I think that the discussion there has been somewhat a bit distorted, but I think it makes complete sense that you can make and run most of your daily activities by not having to travel too much or too far. That makes it simple, easy, and saves you time. And I think that time is a valuable commodity.
15-minute cities is a whole other webinar, that one.
One for another one.
Well, thank you very much to everybody that pre-submitted questions. That was all of our pre-submitted questions that we had. So we'll have a little time at the end to go into the audience Q&A that have been submitted during this last sort of 45 minutes or so. But we're going to wrap up with one final poll before we go into those. If you could fire that poll up now, please. And it is a repeat of the first question that we were asked today, which was, how aware are you around decarbonisation funding now? So essentially, after this webinar, has that helped your understanding of decarbonisation funding? We'll give you another sort of 10 seconds to answer that, and hopefully the answer is a very positive way to go into our Q&A. So if we could close that now. That's excellent. So that's trending in the right direction. A lot more people are in that sort of more understanding role, with more than half, 57% of people have said they are in that sort of number 3 area, so pretty aware of how to access funding. And there's only 4 people of the attendees that have voted have said that they're still not particularly aware of decarbonisation funding. So hopefully we've built a little bit of knowledge there for you all. So that is probably the right time to move over into our Q&A. As I say, I've got around sort of 8 minutes to try and get as many of these in as possible. Now, all 3 of you guys work across the nations and regions, or your businesses do at the very least. Question coming from Elcock: are you seeing a difference in attitude among the governments of the devolved nations to decarbonisation? With you on this one, David.
I've got colleagues that are based up in Scotland, and I think the short answer is yes. In terms of the funding programs that are being delivered, there's more of it by all accounts, and it's being delivered over the longer term. There are lessons being learned. So using the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund as a case in point, what was originally a 12-month funding program became a 2-year funding program, and now it's going to be, funding over 3 years with a delivery window of over 4. So lessons are being learned, but yeah, other regions are doing it differently. Whether it's better, I can't say yay or nay to that one because I'm not directly involved in it. But as well as devolved regions, we've also got devolution coming in relation to certain city regions. So Greater Manchester Combined Authority, the West Midlands is another area that is in discussions with Treasury around devolved decarbonisation funding. It'd be really interesting to follow and see what plans they put in place with this, the new freedoms and powers that they're going to be given.
Excellent. Thank you, David, for your response on that one. We'll push this next one to you, Jose. It's coming from Steve Caulfield. Do you think that in the rush for decarbonisation, we've potentially lost a little sight regarding the energy efficiency of buildings?
I think that's a question that, as we are moving to digasification and digasification, we are decarbonizing the electricity grid. There is an argument that maybe we had moved too much to talking about carbon and less about energy, and that's been brought back to energy, because once we are moving towards electrification of buildings, and the carbon factor therefore is going to be the same for those projects. What's going to be keeping saving electricity is reducing the electricity, the energy that those buildings require. So there is inherently, because of the transition that we are having in the grid, a movement towards energy reduction and energy efficiency, and that's why I made a reference to the energy use intensities that we need to be driving down, and making sure that we're not only capturing the regulated energy use, that is the one that's used for heating, cooling, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, but the unregulated energy use, how we are all those other operational energy uses that take place in buildings that may not be regulated, but they are a very significant proportion of the energy use in those buildings.
And we'll go to you, Jack, just on a slightly adjacent point here that's coming. It's from well, they've not left their name, but it's a really interesting question. Do you think the sort of electrical infrastructure and the power grid is capable of handling the increased loads which come from the removal of fossil fuels?
I think at the moment, probably not is the answer. I mean, I think, as we said, that energy efficiency will have a part to play in reducing demand. I think, we're also looking, I think, when you look at the macro structure of the grid, we're looking at renewable generation happening in different places to where we historically generated power. So we need to bring electricity into the grid in new areas. We need to move it to new areas. And we also need to think about what the kind of storage infrastructure is there as well. I think particularly with the renewable generation, it's windy and you get a lot of wind power. It's not windy and you don't get any wind power. Same for solar and the sun. So I think it's the current infrastructure isn't good enough, and also the resilience within that structure at the moment is not good enough. So I think there's a significant amount of rebalancing that's needed. More looking at how we improve that, bring energy from new parts of the country into the areas that need it.
Excellent. We've probably got time for one more question for coming in here. We'll put this one to you, David, but feel free as the rest of the team to chip in on this. Coming from Todd Reedman, how much of a driver for the decarbonisation of existing stock do you think the impending net zero carbon building standard will be?
Not much, I think, in terms of existing stock. My understanding is that standard relates to new build, and as I think Jose is already, I could be wrong on that one. I'm not 100% up to speed on the contents of that particular standard as it stands. Yeah. But as Jose's already alluded to, 90 odd 80% of the buildings that are going to be present in 2050, the ones that we've already got, if they're not caught by a new build standard, which they aren't going to be, they are still going to be continuing to emit carbon for some time going forward. So the introduction of new standards that drive energy efficiency and decarbonise new build, they're not going to do that much, to be fair, to incentivise the owner-occupied sector. The owners of thousands of buildings as they currently stand to do stuff. We've got minimum energy efficiency standards for corporate landlords and corporate building owners in the same way that we got it for the private sector landlords as well, and social landlords too. But anything that relates to new build isn't necessarily going to incentivize or support the deployment of retrofit in existing buildings would be my initial view. But Jose, come on, man.
No, David, I think that the UK net zero carbon building standard is going to look to include refurbishments. In that, as you say, it's critical and it's very important. We just need to see how that works in practical terms. I think that what brings is a good opportunity by bringing all the different organizations, is the UK Green Building Council, is LETIS, RIBA, SIPSI, RACS, all those, and trying to bring some consensus in terms of how we are defining a standard, trying to bring some clarity to what for clients to understand and for us to be clear on what we are proposing in that in that respect. So it's I think that we need to see how it all develops, but bringing together those the level of expertise of those different organizations, I think, and I'm hopeful that will be useful.
I agree. I think setting those clear standards and, going back to the points, David, you were making earlier about the clarity of scope when you're procuring work, I think if you've got clear standards to procure against, that's going to really support sort of net zero delivery.
Excellent. Well, a great point to finish on. Thank you very much to the three of you for your excellent contributions today. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for, but thanks to everybody for tuning in. Another really well attended webinar, and I can see from the Q&A section that we have still got those coming in, so we'll do our very best to make sure that we can get some sort of responses to you at some point in the very near future. So by signing up for today, you're all now part of the Pagabo Live community, so you will automatically receive a link for our next session in April, where we'll be talking about how the public sector can prepare for the enforcement of the Procurement Act. We're also going to have a newsletter coming out around a week after each of our Pagabo Live sessions that will include a recording of the webinar in video and podcast form. So if that doesn't cause road rage, I don't know what will. And along with further insights from the team, where you may get some of the responses to the Q&As we've not managed to get round to today. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's event and found it useful. So if you have, Tell a colleague, tell a friend, tell your sister. And we're back next month for our next session. Thank you very much.